I did not plan to hide that night. I only stayed because my knees hurt, the engine was warm, and I thought it would be rude to knock too late. But when I heard my daughter's voice through the open kitchen window, low and confident, I knew I should not move, not breathe, not even blink. I am 72 years old. I have lived long enough to recognize the sound of a decision being made without me. Until recently, I would have told anyone that my life was quiet and settled. I live alone in the house my husband and I bought 46 years ago, the same narrow porch, the same oak tree that drops too many leaves every fall. My days are predictable. Medication at 8, a short walk if my hip allows it, soup at noon, the radio in the afternoon. After my husband died, silence became a companion. Not a cruel one, just constant. My daughter, Eleanor, is my only child. She is 50, organized, efficient, always busy. She calls every other day. She insists on driving me to appointments even when I say I can manage. She reminds me of pills I have taken on my own for years. Everyone tells me how lucky I am to have such a caring daughter. I used to agree. Over the past months, her care had become tighter. She started keeping copies of my papers. She asked about the deed to the house, about insurance, about what would happen if something sudden occurred. She spoke gently, the way people speak to children and the very old. I felt smaller after those conversations, though I could not explain why. That evening, I brought her a box of photographs she had asked for, old family pictures, documents, things she said she wanted to scan before they get lost. When I arrived, her car was already in the driveway, but the lights were on and I heard voices inside. I assumed she had company. I did not want to interrupt, so I stayed in the car for a few minutes. That was my mistake. The kitchen window was cracked open. I heard the scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass, then a man's voice, calm, professional. And then my daughter spoke. She did not sound rushed. She did not sound worried. She sounded relieved. "Yes," she said, "everything is moving the way you explained. We don't need to wait much longer." The man asked something I could not fully hear. Papers rustled. "She's slowing down," my daughter continued. "The doctor's notes will support it if needed, and once the last document is signed, it becomes simple." Simple. That was the word she used. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself I was misinterpreting, that I was tired, that 72 is an age when imagination fills in gaps too easily. But then she laughed softly and added, "I just don't want complications later. I've already given enough years to this." Enough years. I sat there, invisible in the dark, listening to my own child discuss my life as if it were an overdue task. I realized then that I was not part of the conversation because, in her mind, I was already almost gone. The engine ticked as it cooled. My legs trembled, but I stayed. Not because I wanted to hear more, but because some truths, once they touch you, leave you unable to move. That night, something old and patient inside me woke up. I drove home slowly that night, taking the long way without thinking about it. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that only comes after 10, when people believe the day is finished and nothing important can still happen. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a long time, hands folded in my lap, listening to my heart thud like it was trying to remind me that I was still here. Inside the house, everything looked the same. The lamp by the sofa, the small crack in the ceiling we never bothered to fix, my husband's chair by the window. Familiar things should comfort you. That night, they only made me feel exposed, as if the walls themselves had overheard what I was not meant to know. I did not cry. That surprised me. I have cried over smaller things in my life. A harsh word, a disappointment, a look that lingered too long. But that night there were no tears, only a cold, careful sorting of thoughts. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I sat at the table and stared at my hands, noticing how thin the skin had become, how blue the veins looked. These were the hands my daughter was already writing off. I went over her words again and again, not the tone, not the laughter, but the certainty. She had not sounded cruel. That was the most frightening part. She sounded practical. As if she were discussing the timing of a repair or the sale of an old appliance. Something worn, something nearing the end of its usefulness. I thought of the last few months. How she had insisted on attending every appointment. How she had answered questions for me before I could open my mouth. How she had begun reminding doctors of my age as if they might forget. I remembered the look on her face when I told her I still balanced my own accounts. Not anger. Disappointment. At 2 a.m, I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room and opened the drawer where I keep my papers. Everything was in order. Deed, insurance, will. The documents were old, some yellowed at the edges, but they were clear. My name, my signature, my decisions. I ran my fingers over them as if checking whether they were still real. I slept little. When I did drift off, I dreamed of standing in my own kitchen while people moved furniture around me, measuring walls, opening drawers, speaking over my head as if I were already gone. I woke before dawn, with my heart racing and my jaw clenched. In the morning, the world continued without apology. The mail arrived. A neighbor waved. The radio spoke about the weather. I made oatmeal and ate it slowly, forcing myself to keep the routine. Panic, I have learned, feeds on disruption. I would not give it that satisfaction. Eleanor called at 10, cheerful, efficient. She asked if I had slept well, if my hip was bothering me, if I remembered that we had an appointment next week to finalize a few things. I answered politely. I said nothing. I listened. When I hung up, I realized something with surprising clarity. She believed she was ahead of me. She believed I was still the woman in the car, frozen, overwhelmed, unsure. She did not yet understand that I had been managing fear longer than she had been alive. By noon, I had made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, just a quiet shift inside myself. I would not confront her. Not yet. I would not accuse, beg, or ask for explanations that could be reshaped into lies. I would observe. I would prepare. At my age, people assume you are slow to act. What they forget is that slowness is not weakness. It is how you survive long enough to choose your moment. The next few days passed outwardly calm, which only sharpened my attention. I moved through them the way I always had, slowly, deliberately, noticing details I used to ignore. At 72, observation is a skill you develop without meaning to. You learn when someone speaks too carefully, when they listen only to reply, not to hear. Eleanor came by on Thursday afternoon with groceries I had not asked for. She lined them up in my kitchen as if arranging evidence of her usefulness. She talked about work, about traffic, about how exhausted she was. Then, almost casually, she mentioned paperwork. I spoke to a colleague of mine, she said, setting apples into a bowl. He knows a very good legal advisor, just for peace of mind. You know how things can get complicated later? I nodded, the way people expect you to nod when they think they are guiding you. My hands were folded on the table. Steady. calm. She pulled out a folder from her bag. A thick one. Too thick for just in case. It's nothing urgent, she said quickly. Just updates. A revised medical power of attorney. A general authorization so I can handle things if you're tired or unwell. It would make everything smoother. Smoother for whom? I wondered. She slid the papers toward me, already uncapping a pen. I noticed how confident she was, how certain she seemed that this was only a formality. She did not ask if I wanted to read them. She assumed I would sign. I picked up the top page and adjusted my glasses. The language was dense, deliberately so. Words like permanent, exclusive, and discretionary appeared more often than comforted me. I read slowly. Eleanor shifted in her chair, checking her phone, sighing lightly, as if my caution were an inconvenience. This one, she said, tapping a line with her manicured nail, just allows me to make decisions if you're not able to. Doctors prefer clarity. I am able, I replied. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. Of course you are. This is only for the future. The future, spoken like a deadline. I signed nothing that day. I told her I was tired. I said I would look everything over properly. She hesitated, then agreed, though her jaw tightened for just a second. A small crack, enough for me to see through. That evening, after she left, I spread the documents across my table. I read them all, twice. There was nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just a slow narrowing of my world, clause by clause. Control presented as care. Authority disguised as protection. I thought of my husband then, how he used to say that the most dangerous theft was the one done politely. No force, no noise, just signatures and patience. The following morning, I called a number I had not used in years. The man who answered remembered me immediately. He had handled our affairs back when my husband was alive, back when decisions were discussed, not managed. We spoke quietly. I asked questions. I did not explain why. I did not need to. He answered carefully, precisely, the way professionals do when they understand more than you've said. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not with fear, with resolve. Eleanor believed time was on her side. She believed age made me passive, grateful, malleable. She mistook silence for surrender. What she did not understand was this. I had already lived through loss, exhaustion, and starting over with nothing but my own name to stand on. Compared to that, paperwork was easy. I placed the folder back into her bag the next time she came, untouched. I smiled. I thanked her. I told her I would let her know. And I meant it. Just not in the way she expected. On Sunday evening she called again. Her voice was light, almost pleasant, the way it used to be before everything became measured. I'll stop by tomorrow, Eleanor said. There's one more thing we should go over. It won't take long. I told her she could come. I did not ask what the thing was. I had learned that questions only helped her rehearse answers. The day passed slowly. I cleaned the kitchen, even though it was already clean. I folded laundry that did not need folding. When you are waiting for something unpleasant, you prepare your surroundings as if order might soften the blow. By late afternoon, my hip was aching, the deep, dull ache that makes every step deliberate. I told myself I would speak briefly and send her on her way. She did not arrive alone. A man followed her up the walkway, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He was neatly dressed, neutral in every way, the kind of man who blends into boardrooms and court corridors. Eleanor introduced him as Daniel. She did not say what he did. She did not need to. "I thought it would be easier if we all talked together," she said, already stepping inside. I felt the smallest tightening in my chest, but my voice remained steady. I invited them in. I made tea. I offered cookies. Politeness has always been my strongest shield. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing words like a surgeon chooses instruments. He explained processes, options, safeguards. He spoke about reducing stress for families, about ensuring continuity, about protecting everyone involved. Eleanor watched me the whole time, not with concern, with calculation. They asked questions I answered without difficulty. My memory, my routines, my finances. I noticed how often Eleanor interrupted to clarify, to reframe, to soften my answers into something weaker. I let her. Each interruption taught me more than her words ever could. After an hour, Daniel closed his briefcase. "There's no pressure today," he said smoothly. "We just wanted to outline the path forward." The path forward. Always forward. Never sideways. Never back. When they left, Eleanor hugged me longer than usual. Her perfume lingered after the door closed. I stood in the hallway until their footsteps faded. Then I locked the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. That night, I could not stay in the house. The walls felt too close, as if the rooms had begun to shrink around me. I put on my coat and drove, not far, just to clear my head. Without quite deciding to, I found myself turning onto Eleanor's street. Her house was lit. The lawyer's car was gone, but another one was parked nearby. I told myself I would drive past and keep going. Instead, I slowed, then stopped. I parked a short distance away, beneath a large maple that cast deep shadows. I left the engine running. My legs hurt too much to move again, and I told myself I was only resting. Voices drifted through the quiet. Laughter at first, then Eleanor's voice, lower now, sharper, no longer performing. "You heard her," she said. "She's resisting, but it won't last." Another voice answered, unfamiliar, impatient. "She can't keep control forever," Eleanor replied. "We just need to be smart, careful." Then the sentence that settled everything inside me. "We don't need to wait much longer." I sat there in the dark, unseen, listening to my daughter discuss my life as a problem nearing resolution. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. She was already planning my absence, and I was done pretending not to notice. I did not leave right away. I sat there until the voices inside dissolved into the dull sounds of a television and clinking dishes. My hands were numb on the steering wheel, not from cold, but from restraint. Every instinct told me to confront her, to walk up to the door and ask her to explain herself like the grown woman she was. But instinct is a young thing. It wants relief, not results. So I waited. When I finally drove home, the streets were empty again. I noticed details I never had before. A porch light flickering, a trash bin tipped over, the quiet confidence of houses whose owners believed nothing would change overnight. I wondered how many people had been discussed in parked cars like this, reduced to timelines and signatures. At home, I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark living room and listened to the house settle. My heart slowed. Something in me hardened, not into bitterness, but into shape. I understood now that what I was facing was not a misunderstanding or a moment of frustration. It was a plan. thought through, prepared, justified. The next morning, I woke early. Pain greeted me before my feet touched the floor, but I welcomed it. Pain is honest. It doesn't pretend to care while waiting for you to weaken. I showered, dressed carefully, and ate a proper breakfast. Then I sat at my desk and made a list. Names, numbers, documents, accounts. I did not rush. I did not dramatize. I simply wrote down everything that was mine, everything I had built, everything I was responsible for protecting. I realized how little of it Eleanor actually understood. She knew the surface, not the structure. That would matter. When she called that afternoon, I answered cheerfully. I thanked her for bringing the lawyer. I said I appreciated her concern. I even apologized for being difficult. She relaxed immediately. I could hear it in her voice, the way people soften when they think resistance has turned into compliance. We agreed to meet again later in the week. After the call, I put on my coat and went out, not to her house, but to an office I had not visited in years. The receptionist recognized my name. The chair in the waiting room was uncomfortable, but I sat straight, my purse on my lap, my thoughts orderly. I explained very little. I did not need to explain everything. I asked precise questions instead. About revocation, about limits, about what could be changed quietly and what required notice. The answers came clearly, calmly. There was nothing irreversible yet. That, more than anything, steadied me. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought things only I liked. Soup my daughter never made. Bread, she said, was too expensive. It felt oddly ceremonial, like marking territory. That evening, I called Eleanor back. I told her I was ready to move forward, slowly, sensibly. I told her I trusted her. The word pleased her more than it should have. When I hung up, I stood at the window and looked out at my yard, at the oak tree, at the place where my life had unfolded piece by piece. I was not afraid anymore. I was alert. She believed she was managing my ending. What she did not know was that I had just begun to manage my defense. The days that followed required discipline, not the loud kind, not the kind people praise, but the quiet discipline of not reacting when every nerve tells you to. Eleanor began calling more often. Short calls. Friendly ones. She asked if I was feeling all right, if my hip was better, if I had reviewed the papers again. I answered each question calmly, giving her nothing solid to push against. Inside, though, everything had changed. I slept lightly, waking before dawn, my mind already moving through possibilities. I noticed how often Eleanor used the word stress, how she framed decisions as relief for me, how she repeated that she only wanted what was best. She never once asked what I wanted. That omission spoke louder than any argument. Midweek, she suggested dinner at her place. "Just us," she said. "No business. We'll relax." I agreed. Her house was spotless, staged in that careful way that leaves no room for accident. She poured wine for herself, water for me. She talked about her job, her plans, her fatigue. I listened and ate slowly, buying time. Halfway through the meal, she mentioned the lawyer again, pretending it was an afterthought. "He thinks it would be good to finalize things soon," she said lightly, "before winter, before anything unexpected." Unexpected. Another deadline disguised as concern. I put down my fork and looked at her then. Really looked. She avoided my eyes for a fraction of a second. That was enough. "You seem very sure," I said. She smiled. I'm just being responsible. I nodded. Responsibility. Such a convenient word. It can mean protection or it can mean possession. The difference lies in who benefits. That night, at home, I took out my husband's old notebook. He kept everything there: numbers, reminders, small observations about people. On the last page, written years ago, was a sentence I had forgotten. Never explain when silence will reveal more. I followed that advice. I made appointments. I signed what needed signing and refused what didn't. I learned how easily access could be limited without drama, how authority could be narrowed quietly, legally. Each step restored a piece of ground beneath my feet. When Eleanor finally asked directly, "Are you ready to sign?" I told her I needed more time. I said my health was unpredictable. I said I didn't want to rush. Her voice changed, not sharply, just enough. "We don't have the luxury of waiting forever," she said. There it was again. Time. Pressure. The countdown she believed was hers to manage. After we hung up, I sat in my chair and felt something settle fully into place. I was no longer confused. I was no longer hurt. I was clear. That night, for the first time since hearing her words through the window, I slept deeply. Not because the danger was gone, but because I had accepted it. And acceptance, I have learned, is the beginning of control. Eleanor thought she was guiding me toward an ending. She did not realize I was preparing for a confrontation she would not recognize until it was too late. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived in layers, like cold settling into old bones. I began to understand that Eleanor was not acting out of panic or sudden necessity. This was something she had rehearsed in her mind long before I overheard it. I was late to my own story. I stopped correcting her when she exaggerated my forgetfulness. When she told friends I was not quite myself lately, I smiled and let it pass. I saw now how easily truth could be bent when wrapped in concern. People want a simple explanation. An aging mother fits neatly into that shape. One afternoon, she suggested I stop driving, not firmly, casually. She said she worried about my reaction time. She reminded me of my hip. She offered to keep my car keys, just in case. I declined, politely. She laughed it off, but her eyes hardened for a moment. Another crack. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of old letters, cards from neighbors, notes from my husband, birthday messages written in my daughter's younger hand, uneven and earnest. I tried to find the moment when care had turned into entitlement. I could not. It was gradual, quiet, like erosion. The following week, Eleanor arrived unannounced. She does that now. She says she worries. I say nothing. She walked through the house with a practiced eye, noticing things she had never cared about before. The stairs, the rugs, the medicine cabinet. "This place isn't really safe for you anymore," she said gently. I looked at her and wondered when she had decided my home was no longer mine. That night, I hid nothing. I did not drive away. I stayed in my house and listened to it breathe around me. I thought about how many years I had managed without help, how many decisions I had made alone. I was not fragile. I was tired of being treated as if I were. The next morning, I made another appointment. Then another. I learned the language of boundaries, written in ink instead of emotion. I learned how much power still belonged to the person whose name was on the paper. Mine. When Eleanor called later that day, I let it ring twice before answering. She sounded irritated, though she tried to hide it. "We need to move forward," she said. "Dragging this out isn't good for either of us." "I agree," I replied. She paused. That was not the response she expected. After the call, I stood by the window and watched the light change across the yard. I felt older than I had a month ago, but I also felt steadier. Age teaches you which battles are worth your breath. I was no longer trying to save my relationship with my daughter. I was trying to save myself. And that, I knew, would cost her more than she anticipated. By the 8th day, I understood that timing would decide everything. Eleanor was growing impatient. I could hear it in the way her sentences shortened, how concern gave way to efficiency. People who believe they are close to winning dislike delays. They fear silence more than refusal. That morning, I dressed carefully and left the house early. I did not tell Eleanor where I was going. I did not need her permission, and I was done explaining myself to anyone who had already decided my limits for me. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries weight. I sat across from a man who did not interrupt me, who did not finish my sentences, who did not speak to me like a project. I placed my documents on the table one by one and watched his expression shift as the picture formed. "You still have full capacity," he said finally. "Nothing has been executed that can't be undone." I nodded. Hearing it aloud mattered more than I expected. We worked methodically. I revoked permissions that were too broad. I replaced them with narrow, precise ones. Temporary became temporary again. Access became conditional. I did not remove Eleanor entirely. That would have provoked questions too soon. I simply made it impossible for her to act alone. When I left the building, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I stopped for coffee and sat by the window, watching people hurry past with their own invisible urgencies. I felt strangely detached from them. I was no longer rushing toward anything. I was arranging. That afternoon, Eleanor called 3 times. I answered on the 4th. She asked where I had been. I told her I had errands. She asked which ones. I said I was tired and would talk later. The pause on the line stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "You shouldn't be running around so much," she said at last. "I've been running my life for decades," I replied. "This is nothing new." She laughed, but it sounded brittle. That evening, I reviewed everything again at home. I placed documents into new folders. I labeled them clearly. I left nothing to interpretation. If something happened to me tomorrow, there would be no confusion, no convenient gaps for someone else to fill. Before bed, I wrote a letter. Not an emotional one, a practical one. Instructions, clarifications, boundaries. I sealed it and placed it in the drawer beneath my husband's notebook. It was not for Eleanor. It was for the world she thought she could manage without me. I slept well that night. Better than I had in weeks. I knew what was coming. Eleanor would sense the shift, even if she could not yet see it. Control does not disappear quietly. It resists. And when she finally pushed, she would discover that the woman she had been waiting to weaken had already moved beyond her reach. By the time Eleanor noticed the change, it was already too late for subtlety. She arrived one morning without calling, her knock sharp, impatient. I let her stand on the porch longer than usual before opening the door. Small things matter when balance is shifting. She stepped inside and immediately began talking, words layered one over another. She said the lawyer had been trying to reach me. She said delays were causing complications. She said she was worried people might start questioning my judgment if things dragged on much longer. That last sentence was delivered carefully, like a warning wrapped in concern. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how she avoided sitting down, how she paced instead, as if movement could keep control from slipping through her fingers. "I took care of some things," I said, when she finally paused for breath. Her body stilled. "What things?" "Necessary ones." That was when her voice sharpened. Not loud, precise. She asked where I had been going lately, who I had been speaking to, why certain offices had returned her calls with vague answers. She did not accuse me directly. She implied. She circled. She always had. I told her calmly that I had reviewed my documents, that I had adjusted them to better reflect my wishes. I did not elaborate. I watched her face as she processed that sentence. The confidence she usually carried slipped, just for a moment, replaced by calculation. "You shouldn't be making changes on your own," she said. "That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt something detach inside me. The guilt I had carried for years loosened its grip. "I have made every important decision in my life on my own," I said. "Raising you included." Her expression hardened. She reminded me of my age, of my health, of how quickly things could deteriorate. She said she was only trying to protect me from mistakes I might regret. I told her I had already lived with regret. It was not new to me. Being erased while still breathing, however, was something I did not intend to accept. The argument did not escalate. That would have required emotion, and I had none left to give her. Instead, it cooled into something more dangerous: distance. She left shortly after, her movements stiff, her farewell abrupt. That afternoon, I received a call from a number I recognized. The lawyer. His tone was cautious now, respectful in a way it had not been before. He asked if I would like to come in and clarify my intentions directly. I told him I would. When I hung up, I felt neither triumph nor relief. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that comes when you stop trying to be understood and start insisting on being acknowledged. Eleanor had believed that my resistance was confusion, that my silence was weakness. She had mistaken endurance for compliance. What she did not understand was that women like me do not collapse loudly. We withdraw, we observe, and when we act, we do so in ways that cannot be undone by raised voices or legal language twisted for convenience. The night settled quietly over the house. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed, knowing that the next move would be hers, and that, for the first time, was not something I feared. The meeting with the lawyer took place 2 days later in a room that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. I arrived early and waited without reading the magazines laid out for distraction. When he came in, he greeted me differently than before. Slower, more attentive. People adjust quickly when authority reasserts itself. He asked me to speak freely. I did. I told him exactly what I had overheard, without embellishment. I repeated my daughter's words as accurately as I could, not with anger, but with precision. I explained the gradual pressure, the framing of concern, the way my independence had been treated as a flaw rather than a fact. I watched him take notes. His pen slowed when I mentioned timelines. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said something important. He said that intent matters, but documentation matters more, and that at present, all authority still rested with me. He said that my changes were valid, my capacity unquestioned, my wishes clear. He said that no one could legally move against me without obvious, provable cause. I thanked him, not with relief, with acknowledgement. When I returned home, Eleanor was waiting in my driveway. She stood beside her car, arms crossed, her posture rigid. The sight of her there did not surprise me. Control, when challenged, seeks proximity. I parked slowly and stepped out, feeling the familiar ache in my hip, grounding me in my body, reminding me that I was still fully present. She spoke before I reached the door. She asked how the meeting went. She asked what I had said. She asked whether I realized how serious all of this was becoming. I told her it went well. I told her I had clarified my position. I did not raise my voice. I did not justify myself. She accused me then, not directly, but through implication. She said people were starting to worry. She said that if something happened, there would be consequences. She said that she had sacrificed years of her life caring for me and deserved some consideration in return. That was when I stopped her. I told her that care given with expectation is not care. It is investment. I told her I had not asked her to sacrifice anything. I told her that my life was not a debt waiting to be collected. Her face changed. The mask slipped fully this time. Irritation replaced patience. She said I was being selfish. She said I was making things harder than they needed to be. She said I was forcing her hand. I asked her what that meant. She did not answer. She left shortly after, her car pulling away too fast, tires scraping gravel. I stood in the driveway long after the sound faded, feeling no urge to chase her, no instinct to repair what she had broken. Inside the house, I moved through the rooms with quiet intention. I locked cabinets. I secured papers. I placed my phone on the table and turned it face down. I understood then that the worst part was over. What remained would be unpleasant, but it would be honest. That night, I wrote one final note to myself. It was simple. It said, "You are allowed to protect what is yours, even from those who believe they deserve it." I slept without dreams. The next morning would bring consequences, conversations, perhaps even threats. But whatever came, it would meet a woman who was no longer confused, no longer polite at her own expense, and no longer willing to disappear quietly for anyone's convenience. The morning after Eleanor left, I woke early, as I always do. The house was quiet, though the silence carried weight now. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind against the window felt like a reminder that the house was still mine, that I still moved through it on my terms. I made tea slowly, deliberately, savoring the warmth that traveled through my hands, grounding me. I had spent the previous days carefully reviewing every document, every clause that had been placed before me. I knew now that nothing needed haste, that patience was my strongest weapon. Eleanor believed pressure would make me yield, but pressure only clarified my boundaries. It reminded me of the years I had spent managing everything myself, raising her, managing bills, and keeping a household together. That experience was not diminished by her impatience. It was reinforced by it. When she called mid-morning, I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was controlled, polite, but with an edge I recognized now. She wanted confirmation, wanted me to react. I answered evenly, reporting that I had completed certain errands, that I was in good health, and that I had reviewed the paperwork thoroughly. She pressed lightly for more details, testing, probing, as if I might falter under the weight of explanation. I offered none. Silence was my ally. By noon, I decided to act on what I had learned. I drove to the bank, carefully choosing a route that allowed me to remain unnoticed by Eleanor's habitual observations. Inside, the familiar clerk greeted me warmly, unaware of the tension that had gathered in my life over the last week. I requested a series of modifications to accounts, access restrictions, and authority levels. Each adjustment was deliberate, legal, and precise. Nothing could be challenged without my explicit knowledge. I felt the familiar clarity that comes with control. Returning home, I organized the documents that now reflected my intentions. Each folder was labeled, each instruction clear. I understood the subtle shift taking place. Eleanor believed she still guided my decisions, but in reality, I had already taken steps to ensure my autonomy. It was not a rebellion, it was a restoration. That evening, Eleanor arrived unannounced again, carrying a briefcase. She smiled politely, as if nothing had changed. I invited her in, offering tea, though I felt no warmth in the gesture, only civility. She began her usual routine, checking schedules, appointments, and paperwork. I let her proceed, observing her closely. Every inflection, every hesitation revealed more than her carefully chosen words. She did not notice that her influence had already been curtailed. When she paused, expecting compliance or discussion, I spoke clearly. I informed her that decisions about my life would be handled according to my terms. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I did not apologize. My tone was calm, precise, measured. The surprise on her face was evident. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her assumptions about control were mistaken. She asked questions, carefully phrased, testing whether I would yield, whether I would revert to the familiar pattern of deference. I answered succinctly. No elaboration, no emotional display. Each answer reinforced the reality she had ignored. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. Eventually, she left, quietly, without the confrontation she had anticipated. I closed the door behind her and walked through the rooms, checking each lock, each folder, each precaution I had established. I was exhausted, but steady. My strength was not loud or visible. It was deliberate, patient, and absolute. That night, I sat by the window, watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the lawn. The world continued beyond my yard, beyond my house, but inside, I felt the profound satisfaction of certainty. Eleanor could try to impose timelines, pressures, and expectations, but they no longer held power over me. I was prepared, capable, and undisturbed. For the first time in years, I felt the full measure of my own authority. The days following Eleanor's last visit unfolded with an almost surreal calm. I moved through the house with deliberate precision, each action measured, each movement an assertion of control. Cooking, cleaning, arranging papers, these routines, once mundane, became acts of quiet power. Every step I took reminded me that my life remained mine, that the space I had carved for myself could not be encroached upon without my consent. I no longer sought permission. I simply acted within the boundaries I had established. By midweek, I had scheduled meetings with the bank and the lawyer, carefully spacing them so that no single action could be anticipated or interrupted. Each consultation reinforced my understanding of legal authority, autonomy, and the subtle ways in which control can be exercised without confrontation. I learned which powers could be revoked instantly and which required procedural notice. Every detail mattered. Every clause could be leveraged to maintain independence. Eleanor, for all her confidence, had underestimated the precision and resolve that years of experience grant a woman managing her own household and her own life. When Eleanor called during that week, her tone was practiced, courteous, but I detected the faintest edge of tension beneath the surface. She asked about errands, health, and appointments, probing for signs of compliance. I responded with calm, factual statements, revealing nothing unnecessary. Her questions grew shorter with each conversation, her certainty faltering, though she masked it with a superficial lightness. Silence, I realized, was my most effective ally. In giving her nothing to exploit, I had shifted the balance without ever raising my voice. Late one afternoon, I returned home from a brief trip to the bank, documents in hand, folders neatly organized and labeled. Each folder represented clarity, autonomy, and a boundary that could not be crossed. I placed them in a cabinet previously designated for routine use, now transformed into a secure repository of my own decisions. My movements were deliberate, my mind steady. I did not feel fear. I did not feel triumph. I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had ensured that her life remained intact, despite years of subtle manipulation. Eleanor arrived unannounced later that day, carrying her usual folder and a polite smile. She spoke in her measured tone, asking about appointments and paperwork, as though the previous days had not revealed a shift in authority. I listened, seated at the kitchen table, sipping tea slowly. Her words, though courteous, rang hollow because they no longer reflected any actual influence over my actions. I answered clearly and directly, without elaboration or apology. The surprise on her face was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, she recognized that the patterns she had relied upon for control were no longer operative. As the afternoon faded, she attempted to press for compliance, invoking concerns about health, responsibility, and the consequences of delay. I met each point calmly, stating facts, asserting boundaries, and refusing to be guided by expectation or implied obligation. Her questions became hesitant, her voice uncertain. By the time she left, her posture betrayed irritation, and her smile lacked warmth. She understood, even if she would not admit it, that the quiet authority I had cultivated was unyielding. After the door closed, I moved through the house, inspecting each lock, reviewing each document, confirming that every precaution had been taken. I did not rush. I did not panic. I simply observed and verified, reinforcing the framework I had established. It was not about confrontation or revenge. It was about preservation, clarity, and the assertion of a life lived fully and deliberately. That evening, I sat by the window, the fading light tracing the outlines of the yard and the oak tree. I felt neither anger nor triumph, only a profound sense of stability. Eleanor could attempt pressure, manipulation, or persuasion, but she could not penetrate the structure I had put in place. I had reclaimed control quietly, methodically, and decisively. For the first time in many years, I understood that true authority lies not in forceful displays, but in the calm, unshakable assertion of one's own choices and boundaries. The following morning, I awoke with a sense of clarity I had not felt in years. The decisions I had made over the past week, revoking permissions, reinforcing boundaries, securing my documents, were now fully operative. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my autonomy was no longer a matter of debate. Eleanor had underestimated my resolve. She had believed that persistence, subtle persuasion, and the assumed deference of age would eventually bend my will, but she had misjudged the depth of my experience and patience. I moved through my home deliberately, checking each folder and folder of documents. Each piece of paper was a small fortress, an assertion of control that could not be circumvented. I had organized them in a way that even the most careful scrutiny could not bypass. There was no room for misinterpretation, no gaps for manipulation. Everything was precise, lawful, and final. My home, my life, and my decisions were firmly in my hands. Eleanor arrived that afternoon, as she had often done, carrying a folder and a carefully polite smile. She spoke about schedules, appointments, and her concerns for my well-being. Her voice was controlled, professional even, but it carried an underlying tension that was unmistakable. I listened quietly, offering only brief, measured responses. Each answer I gave reinforced the reality that I had re-established authority. Her subtle probes were met with calm clarity, leaving no opportunity for maneuver. I watched the surprise flash briefly across her face when she realized that the person she had long assumed would defer to her wishes was no longer compliant. She attempted once more to assert influence, citing concern for my health and suggesting that certain actions were in my best interest. I met each point directly and without emotion. I stated the facts. I confirmed boundaries. I reminded her that years of independence were not easily relinquished. Her confidence faltered, and for the first time, she understood that patience and preparation had replaced fear and compliance. She left shortly after, her departure brisk, her customary assurance diminished. Alone again, I walked through my home, methodically reviewing locks, cabinets, and documents. Each step reinforced the structure I had built, each action an affirmation of my authority. This was not an act of defiance. It was a restoration of order, a reclaiming of the control that had been subtly eroded over time. I felt no triumph, no need for drama, only the deep, steady satisfaction of a life directed on my own terms. That evening, I sat by the window, the fading light stretching across the yard and the familiar oak tree. I reflected on the changes of the past weeks. The confrontation, though indirect, had shifted the balance irreversibly. Eleanor could attempt pressure, but her influence had limits she could not yet comprehend. I felt a quiet power, the kind that comes not from force, but from the unwavering assertion of one's own choices. In the calm, I understood fully that true authority lies in the deliberate, patient execution of self-determined actions. And for the first time in a long time, I was entirely, undeniably in control. The next morning, I felt a profound stillness. The house, familiar and unchanged, held an unusual weight, a quiet confirmation of the work I had accomplished over the past weeks. I moved deliberately through each room, ensuring that every document was in order, every cabinet locked, every account verified. It was not vigilance born of fear, but the steady assurance that my decisions could no longer be questioned or circumvented. Eleanor's attempts at control had been methodical, but so had mine, and patience, combined with clarity, had created a balance she could not easily disrupt. By late morning, I prepared for a visit I had been planning quietly. I dressed with care, not to impress, but to assert the dignity that comes from knowing one's own worth. My husband's old coat draped over my shoulders as I left, and I walked with purpose, not haste. The air was crisp, and each step across the pavement reminded me that age need not mean acquiescence. Every decision I had made over the last week had been deliberate. Every action was a claim of my autonomy. The lawyer's office was calm, the staff accustomed to routine, unaware of the tension I carried. I met with him, not to debate, but to finalize details that had already been set in motion. We went through the adjustments I had made to powers of attorney, access to accounts, and other legal instruments. Each amendment, each revocation, each reaffirmation of my authority was confirmed without dispute. The process was methodical, precise, and entirely within my rights. By the time I left, the framework of my autonomy was fully reinforced, legally and practically unassailable. Returning home, I encountered Eleanor once more. She had arrived unannounced, a folder in hand, her posture carefully controlled. I invited her in, maintaining civility, while inside I felt a quiet triumph. She began her usual routine, asking about appointments, reviewing documents, seeking assurances. I responded succinctly, clearly, leaving no openings for manipulation. Her attempts at guidance, cloaked in care, faltered against the framework I had constructed. It was evident in the subtle tension in her voice and the hesitation in her gestures that her assumptions about my compliance were incorrect. We spoke briefly, calmly, without the anger or drama that might have been expected. I stated my intentions clearly, affirming that all decisions regarding my affairs would be handled according to my direction. Her questions became careful, measured, as she tried to navigate the new reality she faced. By the time she left, the balance had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer a passive participant in her plans. I was an active architect of my own life. That evening, I sat by the window, looking out at the yard, the oak tree casting long shadows across the lawn. The house was silent, but within it, I felt the full weight of my restored authority. Eleanor could attempt to influence, to persuade, even to intimidate, but she would encounter a resolve that was deliberate, patient, and unshakable. I understood fully that true power lies not in confrontation, but in the careful, unwavering assertion of one's own choices. In the quiet, I felt a deep and lasting sense of triumph, not over her, but over the circumstances that had once threatened to diminish me. For the first time in many years, I was entirely, undeniably in control. The last conversation happened without raised voices or dramatic pauses. Eleanor came in the afternoon, not unannounced this time, but with a stiff politeness that felt rehearsed. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded too neatly, her eyes alert. She was waiting for something to give. I was waiting for her to finish. "I know you've made changes," she said finally. "People are talking. This doesn't look good." I nodded. I did not ask who those people were. They always exist when someone feels their authority slipping. "I heard you," I said. My voice surprised even me. It was calm, low, steady. "That night, when you said you didn't need to wait much longer." The words hung between us. For the first time since this began, she did not interrupt. She did not explain. She did not deny it. Her face went very still, like someone realizing the floor beneath them is no longer solid. "That's not what you think," she started, out of habit more than conviction. "I'm not interested in what you meant," I replied. "I'm interested in what you planned." She looked away then, just briefly. That was enough. I told her what I had done, not in detail, not as a threat, just facts, the documents, the boundaries, the decisions now set in place. I told her I would continue living in my home, managing my affairs, choosing my days. I told her she was still my daughter, but she was no longer my manager. She asked what I wanted from her. The question sounded strange, as if she had never considered it before. "Respect," I said. "And distance, if you can't offer the first." She left shortly after. No apology, no argument. Just a quiet departure that felt heavier than shouting ever could. I watched her car disappear down the street and felt something loosen inside me that I had been carrying for years. Life did not suddenly become easy after that. My body still aches. Nights are still long. Some days are painfully quiet, but the silence is different now. It is mine. No one is waiting for me to weaken. No one is counting my days. I spend my mornings slowly. I water the plants. I sit with my tea by the window. I make decisions without explaining them. When people speak to me now, they listen more carefully. Authority has a way of changing the air around you. I am not a victim. I am not brave. I am simply a woman who chose not to disappear quietly. If you are reading this and something in it feels familiar, don't dismiss that feeling. Age does not erase your right to choose. Love does not require surrender. And dignity is not something you ask permission for. If this story spoke to you, stay with it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, your life is still yours, for as long as you decide to hold it.